Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, July 12th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about some of the realignment news. Florida State and Clemson might just be heading to the Big 12. That sounds like it might just be an option, sort of a backup option, but definitely something that we should talk about and kind of unpack. And then we'll get into UGA. There were a couple other incidents at UGA with traffic violations from some football players. I want to unpack that and how this is becoming a big problem, has been a big problem at UGA for quite some time, and kind of just unpack it a little bit and figure out just how they move forward more than anything else. But then we'll get into recruiting. We'll break down all of the updates that you guys need to know. A ton of big-time recruitments coming up towards the end of this month and into August. Then we'll get into some college football updates. There are so many things happening around college football. They release player ratings, gameplay. They release Dynasty and Road to Glory modes. We'll break down everything that you need to know about a week out from this game being in hand. And then we have a weekend wrap-up for you guys. We're going to get the biggest stories in college football that we just didn't have a chance to get to throughout the week, and we'll break them down for you today. Hi, Anthony. Nice to meet you. But let's go ahead and, before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a great help to us, but not only to us, to you guys as well. You can have a kind of fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for everyone. Again, that's gsmcspodcast.net. Alright, let's get into this, and that is actually what I'm going to talk about right about now. The Big 12 seems to be moving in the direction of Florida State and Clemson. Ross Dellinger was talking to a Big 12 reporter, John Kurtz, on Yahoo Sports, when he talked about kind of the options for Florida State and Clemson and how they can kind of move forward after, a very confusing last 9 months. I don't know if anyone else feels this, but I really do feel like there is not too much of a plan from Florida State and Clemson's perspective. I think they do have something in the works. I'm not saying that they're going into this totally blindly, but they sued their conference about 9 months ago now. About 9 months for Florida State, 8 for Clemson, and I've yet to see any concrete news about where they're actually going. I know that the Big 12 is an option. I know the SEC and Big 10 is where they want to go, which is what Ross Dellinger said. He did say also a second option was reform the ACC to a smaller number of teams, which would be a really Herculean effort for the Florida State and Clemson brass to kind of get together, but at the end of the day, I suppose that is an option. And then finally, he talked about the idea of them going to the Big 12. And I think this is something that is going to be really interesting to watch for tons of different reasons. And the biggest one for me is the Big 12 is the most aggressive conference in the country right now. When it comes to conference realignment, when it comes to putting themselves in a better position going forward, there is no one that's attacking this quite as aggressively as the Big 12 is. They are going after every single thing they can in terms of revenue, in terms of private equity possibly getting involved. All of it is on the table for Brett Yormark and company, and it should be no surprise necessarily. They really want to fight to be that third conference in the future Power 3 possibly if the ACC does kind of fold here. And I think there will be a ton of things to happen. And frankly, Anthony, I really don't know. I think that's one of the big things here where they went out and, got into this fight with the ACC, and I've yet to see any big-time updates that are concrete. I haven't seen anything that has said, this definitely really helps Florida State, or this definitely really helps the ACC keep these teams intact. So it's very much a kind of rocking ship. It's going back and forth. I'm not necessarily sure where it's going to land, but at the end of the day, I did make a segment last week talking about Florida State and Clemson and the confusion really just around their move and where they're going to end up and all of this different stuff. And I got a comment saying, obviously they're going in with a plan. Obviously they're, jumping in with an actual plan to do this the right way and go to the SEC or the Big Ten. And that's what I thought too, frankly, when I got into this thing, when they finally sued the ACC and all of this stuff was going to start happening. my mind was immediately like, okay, so they've talked to the SEC, they've talked to the Big Ten, they've set up, because that's essentially what happened with Texas and OU. If you remember when that was released, that Texas and OU intended to leave the Big 12, it was followed right up with they intend to go to the SEC. It was almost the same exact thing for a lot of the Pac 12 teams. We knew pretty much within 24, 48, or maybe even a week, but we knew very, very quickly where these schools were going to end up at the end of the day. We have really no idea where Florida State and Clemson are going to end up. I tend to believe that at the end of the day, it's going to be the SEC. I am doing that kind of just off instinct more than anything else, because I am very, very conflicted here. And I think I'm going to go back to the Big 12 just being really, really aggressive in the market right now, and why that might just help them a little bit. Bringing in private equity fixes one of the biggest problems that Florida State and Clemson have with the way that the ACC is working, which is the problem that a lot of people have: the money. Everyone wants to make that extra little bit of money. I do think that there's going to be so much different stuff that kind of goes on in this. And as Anthony just brought up in the chat here, I mean, there's a reality where they start splitting up these sports. I saw earlier that SEC was trying to add Duke as a basketball program, but nothing else. That would be a crazy way to go about business, because dividing these athletic departments kind of how you see fit is a very interesting proposition, and opens a lot of doors for a lot of not so great things to happen to some of these smaller sports in this equation. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch this unfold. But when you talk about the Big 12 right now and the future of what they can be and who they're going to be going forward, I really don't think anything is off the table. When Brett Yormark was at Big 12 Media Days and he made a remark saying, "I will not rest until we are the number one conference in the country," let's be honest, he's not resting for quite some time if that's his goal, even if Florida State and Clemson come right along. But there's also rumors about Miami and Notre Dame possibly talking to the Big 12. So if that happens, then things get even more interesting. And obviously, all of this is mostly conjecture. All of this is mostly just some speculation more than anything else. But it doesn't change that it opens this massive door where it feels like Florida State and Clemson are still entirely open for business. It feels like their future has not been decided by any means. And I think that's kind of the biggest thing I'm taking away from this, that when you get into these type of situations and when you start to fight your conference, whether it was or Texas and OU against the Big 12, or this scenario against the ACC, you got to have a plan. It's weirdly, it's kind of like a kid going into the portal. I've talked about this a little bit, but going into the portal is a terrifying proposition. There are so many things that can go wrong with you going into the portal and you jumping over to another team. What happens if no one really is that interested in you? What happens if you get to the new place and you realize it's not the greatest fit and it's not where you want to be? All of this stuff can go wrong. It's no different for conference realignment. The reality is that there's a lot more people that have control over this, so it makes it look a little bit smoother. But the reality is you are jumping into kind of an unknown space. You're jumping into a space where right now Florida State and Clemson, they're obviously in the ACC, but for lack of a better term, they're essentially 1 foot out the door. They are half in the conference as far as I'm concerned. They are half in about every other conference in the country. So it's one of those things that if the Big 12 can make the private equity stuff happen, if they can up that number to possibly 30, 40 million a year more for their schools to kind of bridge that gap between the SEC and them, I think this is an option. I think it's not necessarily even that bad of an option. If you're a Florida State and Clemson and you are getting paid roughly what the SEC and the Big Ten are getting paid, which, let's be honest, is a huge leap for the Big 12 to make and will take a ton of legwork from Brett Yormark and company, but he can do it. I can almost promise you that. But at the end of the day, if that happens and you can be the two schools walking into this conference, at least from a football perspective, as the leaders of this conference, I don't think it's the worst idea in the world. I understand that it is moving from a third-tier conference to the other third-tier conference, but at the end of the day, you do get yourself in better position. You do get yourself better money. You do get yourself at the top of a conference that you'll likely be in the mix to win or win every year, and that puts you in the playoff most years. So it is kind of this interesting idea where when they sued about 9 months ago and all of this stuff started to go down, you're thinking, okay, SEC is the first one that comes to mind because of the proximity, because Florida State and Florida would be a great conference matchup, although the SEC has shown a little bit of hesitancy to go back into Florida and back into South Carolina for Clemson, so that'll be an interesting thing to watch. But overall, that was where my head was at. No two ways about that. I really fully thought that they were going to be SEC teams, and I thought that news was going to come pretty quickly, if I'm being totally honest, and it didn't. And it still hasn't. There hasn't been any real concrete news about where they're going to end up at the end of this and how quickly all of that's going to happen. Ross Dellinger kind of alluded to this when he was talking about it, where this could take a long time. That exit deal, that number that they have to meet with all the different fees and everything is astronomical, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to get to. So unless that number comes down significantly, this could be a drawn out process a little bit. But on the other side of that, if they don't want to be in the ACC in 2025, it's got to happen pretty quickly. You have to let the conference know, I believe by August 16th, somewhere in the middle of August, that you don't want to be, or that you're not going to be there in 2025. If they don't do that, then they're stuck for 2025, and then we revisit this probably in a year from now. But the reality is, it's one of the very interesting cases in conference realignment that I've seen where I don't know what the plan is. I really have yet to see a concrete plan from what Florida State and Clemson are doing, and I'm sure they'll find their way through this. I tend to believe that they'll somehow find their way into the SEC after all this craziness, but at the end of the day, it is a little bit worrisome to me that they just haven't quite found a place, haven't quite found a groove with one of these conferences, and there's not that comfort to say, if we leave the ACC tomorrow, we're in the Big Ten by Monday, or we're in the SEC by Monday. I think that's the worry that everyone is kind of going under right now. So it'll be interesting to watch. There's no two ways about that. Brett Yormark absolutely wants to add these people into the fold. If it's not Florida State and Clemson, he's coming after people. I can promise you that, whether it's Miami. Although I think Miami might be a Big Ten choice because of the AAU accreditation, but this is something we can always unpack as this kind of unfolds. But it feels like the Big 12 might be going on the offensive, and if they do, the ACC might just be in a little bit of trouble. But we'll break that down as it kind of unfolds over the next couple of weeks, months, years. It's going to be crazy. But we're going to take our first break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about UGA. There were a couple other arrests around traffic violations for the UGA football players. I'll break down what those are and how this is just a real issue in the UGA football program and how they can at least try to fix this going forward. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.